I'm the one standing between you and the reception now, officially. I don't have a PowerPoint, but I will talk about power, and I do have a few points to make. So, before we start talking about the standard issues that are often raised when people talk about industrial policies and how do we finance industrial policies in the Global South, before we blend the finance, before we KPI your entire life, before you de-risk the projects, let's get to the structural issues so that we know what we're trying to do. And when it comes to Africa in particular and the rest of the Global South, it's very important to recognize and to understand that there is a particular economic role that was imposed on the African continent during colonial times for colonial purposes. And that particular role persists to this day. And unless we undo that economic function that was imposed on the Global South, we're not going to be successful on the climate front, on the SDGs, on a just transition, or even on democracy. So, three major roles. Number one, Africa was supposed to be the place for cheap raw materials for the industrialized world. We still play that function to this day. Number two, Africa was supposed to be the consumer of industrial output and technologies from the rest of the world, the industrialized world. We still play that function to this day. That has to change. And number three, and most importantly, we're supposed to be the place where obsolete technologies, assembly line manufacturing, that is no longer needed in the industrialized world, is outsourced to the Global South under the label of development, cooperation, job creation, but effectively what it does is that it permanently locks you at the bottom of the hierarchy, at the bottom of the value chain. So those are the three main economic functions, and let's remember that those colonial structures were not designed to deliver development. They were not designed to deliver democracy or SDGs. Colonial systems were abusive, violent, extractive, hierarchical, undemocratic. So why do we today somehow develop this idea that somehow the same economic structures will somehow produce a just transition, somehow will produce development, or achieve any of the sustainable development goals that we set for ourselves? So before we blend the finance and do all of that stuff, let's figure out how do we undo those structures. And we live in a global economic architecture that was designed for that purpose. When I say global economic architecture, it's the financial architecture, that's the World Bank and the IMF. It's the international trade and investment architecture, that's the WTO, essentially. And especially when it comes to the rules related to intellectual property and technology, transfer of technology system. And then you have the international taxation architecture, which for the longest time was in the hands of the OECD countries until very recently, thanks to the UN vote to create a UN tax convention framework, which is very aggressively resisted by OECD countries. And it's still work in progress, but at least it's a step in the right direction, sort of to decolonize that pillar of the economic architecture. Everybody's talking about the financial architecture, but good luck transforming that with the US veto power and the IMF and the World Bank. The blind spot for a lot of these conversations is the WTO. And guess what? The recent trade disruptions that the Trump administration has created is sort of opening a window of opportunity to actually go head-to-head with the WTO rules, but only if the Global South is organized and clear-headed enough to know how do we transform the rules of the WTO. So those are the structural issues you want to start with. Then point number two, you can count that as point number one from my PowerPoint. Point number two is this idea that somehow developing countries will industrialize one country at a time. Now, unless you're the size of China or India, you're not going to industrialize alone. Why? Because to industrialize, you have to have economies of scale, which means if you don't have economies of scale, you're going to end up manufacturing a small component in somebody else's industrial policy. Right? So we have ministries of industries and ministers of industry who are mandated to develop a national industrial policy. And then you end up doing what? De-risking investment for multinational corporations to attract them to set up factories to produce a small component in somebody else's industrial policy. That's not industrialization. However, if you take regional economic blocks, take the African continent as a block by itself, you have the youngest labor force on the planet, literally. You have all the critical minerals that the rest of the world actually wants, which is the basic input for the 21st century, right? You have the economies of scale on a continental scale. You have the complementarity of resources and capabilities, which is what you need for joint industrial policies. But you're lacking a couple of things. One is political leaders who are clear-headed enough to understand that you actually need joint industrial policies, that nobody's going to industrialize alone. And that's a big problem, which I can get to in a minute. But also you have another problem, which is you don't have the manufacturing technology that allows you to leapfrog in key industries. Because the key industries that you need, especially in the African continent, is not producing batteries for US manufacturers, EV batteries, or for European manufacturers to outcompete the Chinese EV manufacturers. That's not an African priority, right? But unfortunately, there's a lot of incentives from the US now for Zambia, for the DRC, for Tanzania to set up EV battery manufacturing when we're talking about countries that don't even have electricity for their own people, right? But the priority is to produce EV batteries on the cheap to compete with the Chinese EVs. So the priority is the following industries. Number one, to manufacture and deploy the renewable energy infrastructure for the continent, to deliver first to the 650 million people who have no access to electricity as we speak, to manufacture and deploy the clean cooking infrastructure for the 950 million people, mostly women and children, inhaling toxic fumes on a daily basis. That's an industrialization opportunity. To manufacture and deploy the clean, green public transportation infrastructure to build the logistics of development and prosperity. And here we're talking about replicating the entire value chain of these industries. And if you think of just these industries replicating an entire value chain, components of these value chains are actually springboards to many other key industries that will come out of that industrialization. So the manufacturing technology that allows you to leapfrog into this type of industrialization, the technology is available in the global north, is available in China. So why is this technology not part of the discussion when we talk about climate negotiations, for example, in COP, which we do actually bring up from a global south perspective, and you see very clearly that that's a red line. No, we're not here to talk about manufacturing, we're here to talk about emissions. It's like, what do you mean? But this is climate policy. This is how you actually decarbonize the world economy. No, we can talk about that in another conference, not here, not today. Don't talk about that, right? That's not the purpose. And then you realize that it's actually intentional. Here's why. This is where power and geopolitics comes in. If you look at IRENA's report, IRENA is the International Renewable Energy Agency, from 2 years ago on Africa. You can read it straight from the executive summary. Africa by 2040, which is the day after tomorrow, actually, by 2040, with existing renewables technologies, not with new innovations and fancy tech stuff, with existing renewables technology, can produce by 2040 1,000 times its anticipated energy needs from renewables and completely replace all of the continent's fossil fuel exports. 1,000 times. If that's not the economic powerhouse of the 21st century, I don't know what is. Now, match that potential, which is real, with the fact that Africa attracts less than 2% of financing that goes towards renewables, global financing. Actually, the number was updated as of last week. A few days ago, I was at the IRENA conference in Bonn, and they said the number is now 1%, actually, not 2%. So how do you explain that? We're in a climate crisis. We're talking about this massive potential for a continent that can completely change the world when it comes to decarbonizing energy production, And yet, it's a continent that's denied access to the financing and denied access to the manufacturing technology that will unleash this potential. And it's very simple. It's because what we perceive as a huge potential, as a win-win for everybody, is actually perceived as a threat to be eliminated, as a risk to be minimized. Because it's as if you took the economic weight, the geopolitical weight of the OPEC countries, the oil exporting countries, multiply that by 1,000. It's perceived as a huge geopolitical disruption to the system, because there's this perception that the world operates as a hierarchy, as a colonial hierarchy, countries at the top and countries at the bottom. If you unleash the potential for Africa and the rest of the global south, which is the global majority, by the way, that's close to 80% of the world population, if you unleash that potential, then you escape the bottom of the hierarchy, you structurally decolonize that economy, and then somebody else must drop at the bottom of the hierarchy, right? There is no real belief in the possibility of actually allowing development and industrialization and decarbonization in a new international economic order that is actually truly multipolar, without anybody dropping at the bottom of the hierarchy. The perception that there might be a win-win scenario, countries at the top of the hierarchy don't actually believe in that. They believe somebody must drop at the bottom of the hierarchy. And that is just not right. So I'll give you, since I do have time, just a little taste of where some of my work in this has been moving. So we understand the geopolitics of this, but it's really kind of frightening when you hear, off-the-record conversations, behind closed-door conversations about this, especially in the climate space. And I'll share this since we're being recorded without naming any particular publication, but a senior editor at a major newspaper that I think all of you read on a daily basis, you probably know which one it is, who's very familiar with these questions, with the issue of transfer of technology to unleash this potential, with real industrialization in the global south. Shared with me the content of an off-the-record 3-hour conversation with a senior official in the OECD in charge of industrialization about these questions. And this was November 2023, before COP in Dubai. And he said the gist of those 3 hours is the following: nobody in the global south is allowed to industrialize without our approval. So the perception is that this is a red line. This is massively disruptive, which is why you go to COP29 last year in Azerbaijan, which was supposed to be the climate finance COP, and you realize at the end of the day, this was not about climate finance. This was not even about climate. This was about the geopolitical hierarchy that is not willing to be disrupted. Because the kind of climate finance we were asking for was transformative climate finance, was actually development finance to unleash this potential. So when you hear those red lines and you see those red lines, you have to start thinking differently. You can't ignore the geopolitical leverage. So the question becomes, how do you create a geopolitical leverage, an economic leverage that will actually compel the other side to think differently, to actually see a potential win-win scenario, to actually give up this obsession with, hierarchies that must persist? So you can go to COP and kind of make the economic case, the financial case, the legal case, the moral case, the ethical case. You get nothing, right? Even though the official speeches, we're all in this together, we're going to figure out climate finance and all of that. You get crumbs at the end, but no transformation. So the question becomes that leverage that needs to be created. I think there's a small window of opportunity, and I only have a minute to say what is worth a little booklet that I'm working on. But I'll give you a taste of it, and I'm here for the next 3 or 4 days, so I'm happy to unpack the rest of it. But picture for a moment having a block of global south countries without China, with predefined joint industrial policies to manufacture and deploy what we just talked about. Imagine we've done our homework and we've designed it in a way that doesn't reproduce the current problems that we have and the global economy or the hierarchies. Imagine that bloc going to a country like China, which actually has the entire value chain you want to replicate, and saying, look, we give you the bargain of the century. If you agree to share technology as in joint ventures, right? We're not asking for financing because we pay for our labor with national currencies. We pay for our materials with national currencies. Normally, you need dollars to borrow money to bring the technology, and then you're set up into an export-oriented model where you can actually never develop. But here, imagine it's a transfer of technology, in-kind contribution, to unleash this potential, to manufacture and deploy, say, solar at scale in the global south. In 10 to 15 years, if China agrees to do this, in 10 to 15 years, you can double your economic footprint, you can double your geopolitical weight, secure your access to these precious minerals, and over time, more countries will join the global south bloc because this is real development, which means you have privileged access to the largest market on the planet with rising purchasing power. China will agree to this bargain. Just triggering this process, the idea is not to put China at the top of the hierarchy, of course. Just triggering this process gives you the second bargaining chip, which then you can use to go to Germany and say, look, we give you the same deal if you transfer technology on these terms to manufacture and deploy wind turbine technology. You go to France or Spain, say high-speed rail on our terms, manufactured here. At that point, they can't say no. And there's plenty of business for everybody, but on terms that are defined by the global majority. The idea is not to allow anybody to go at the top of the hierarchy or anybody to drop at the bottom of the hierarchy, but to create a truly multipolar world with a new international economic order of peace, justice, and sustainable prosperity. Thank you.